Hello, everyone. So we are late, sorry, but we are so happy to welcome Kai Halley with us. So wait for it. Kai Halley, she's the head of UX methods and processes at Google. Wow. And yeah, her job is to create and scale programs to enable the culture and mindset that improves Google's product quality. She's one of the founders and lead of the Google Sprintmaster Academy, and she has trained hundreds of sprint masters at Google to drive innovation across Google's diverse product areas. But Google has also been impacted by COVID, like you, just like me. And in this talk, Kai will share with us how Google has quickly adapted their collaboration and innovation approach during this last month, shifting from working totally on site at Google and they went totally remote. So please welcome from San Francisco, Kai Halley.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be following such incredibly inspiring talks, particularly Surya's, who just came before me, and what an incredible lineup of speakers. So thank you all thank you so much, Steph, for putting this on and having me here today. Steph is driving my slides, so just as a note for folks, no backwards, Steph. All right, we'll get this, I promise. So yes, I wanted to talk to you all today about, how we've been fostering future-ready cross-functional teams. The team that I work on right now supports and grows the discipline of UX across the company. So when I first started at Google, almost 9 years ago now, I was a visual designer on the search ads team. I really struggled when I first joined Google because the UX team was working very much in a silo. And this was the same for the engineering teams and the product management teams. Stay right here while I give you guys all a little context.
If you can just make me clear signs so I know.
I will. I'll just say next also. How about that? Back in 2011, when I was working on the search ads team, we really did struggle to collaborate. I didn't have much access to my engineers. We didn't sit in the same building. I didn't have visibility into the strategy that my product managers were setting, or the OKRs and goal setting that they were doing. And it's really hard to be effective at driving great products when you're working in a silo and working alone. So I was lucky enough at that time to participate in what was our first innovation week, which then evolved to become our annual sprint week, where we started trying on design sprint methods that we were developing at that time. And I discovered what an incredible framework this was for breaking down these silos and bringing together all of these perspectives, getting to the heart of what is desirable, what is feasible, and what is profitable for the company. So this really was the beginning of a transformation in the way that I worked, as well as the way that many Googlers were working at the time. And I became very inspired by this framework and methodology, and started training Googlers after that. Next slide. What does it mean to be future ready, and how does this relate to cross-functional collaboration? Yes, we all know cross-functional collaboration is amazing. It does unlock lots of great opportunities and potential when you're able to get teams to work together. But being future ready, it's not about having a magic crystal ball that will allow you to see into the future. Imagine my magic crystal ball on this slide. It's really a way of being and an approach to working. Next slide. So I think about it as building organizations that are adaptable and agile, creating the teams that are able to pivot quickly and adapt to changing circumstances, being able to identify when you need to pivot, as well as creating an environment that is safe for experimentation. So being experimentation oriented. And that also then lends you to resilience. So when you run these experiments and they don't work, to be able to pick yourself back up, to embrace that failure and learn from it as you go. And then, of course, inherent in all of this is navigating complexity. And we're in ever more complicated times these days. And, navigating complexity is its own discipline that you can, there are lots of great experts who speak about this, but in order to be able to design experiments that we're going to learn from, we really have to have strong systems thinking and understand the factors that are involved that we're dealing with. Next slide, please. So many of these can be considered characteristics of a learning organization, and this is not a new concept. Peter Senge popularized the concept of learning organizations back in 1990. And a lot of these, he picked out 5 characteristics: systems thinking, personal mastery, mental models, shared vision, and team learning. And these are all things that are, really part and parcel of being future ready. Steph, next slide, please. So our Sprint Master Academy program and our Design Sprints program really focuses on building these capabilities, these characteristics, and infusing them into our product development process. So for example, we help Sprint Masters with building their own personal mastery and deep expertise. They work hands-on with product teams to help them create shared visions, to help them learn as they go. So all of these characteristics are really infused into our product development process through the design sprint process and through these critical sprint masters that we train to help lead teams through the process. Next slide, please. And one example, Syria also shared an example of having to pivot and change due to these very unprecedented times. When we were all literally grounded back in March, we really had to pivot quickly. We had critical sprints that were in flight, that sprint masters were, ready to get on a plane to Australia, ready to get on a plane to Singapore, to work in person on, really important projects. And we tended to think up until this point very much about design sprints as an in-person activity. We would rely on getting everyone in a room together and having all of the benefits that come with working in person. So we didn't have that much expertise in this area. Next slide, please. We had deep mastery of design sprints, as I mentioned, and since 2014, when we started the Academy, we've trained thousands of UXers, and we have an incredibly engaged community of 400 expert sprint masters who are running sprints across all of Google's product areas. Next slide, please. But remote sprinting was pretty new to us. We looked across the organization and we said, hey, who is anybody doing this? I'd run a couple out of necessity. In general, we kind of saw them as like last resort. But we realized this was something we were going to have to learn really quickly. We were going to have to pivot our practice and then scale our learnings as fast as we could. Next slide. So in order to do this, we took one small step, was a small experiment, and we said, hey, let's get everyone together, with our first week in which we were required to work from home, and, surfaced and invited the sprint masters who had been running remote sprints to share their expertise, to share their learnings. And this quickly turned into a platform and a weekly session where we could bring in experts from outside and share, as people were learning inside, the resources and tools and templates that they were building as they were rapidly transitioning their practice from in-person to virtual. So we were able to amplify the knowledge that we were creating and scale it, across our 4,000 person organization. Next slide, please. And one of the things that we discovered through this process was that we couldn't just take our traditional full day, multi-day design sprint, whether we were running 3 days or 4 days or 5 days. We couldn't just translate this into the virtual environment and just hold a video collaboration session for 8 hours a day. This just wasn't humanly possible. A couple sprint masters actually did do it initially and found that it was not the most effective way to work, not just for the distribution of time, but also for all the other demands on people's lives and what they were going through and still are continuing to juggle these days. Next slide, please. So we were doing, and we still are doing, some where we distribute over time zones in shorter time sessions, looking at how can we, set this up to be human and to combat video conference fatigue. But what we really discovered, next slide, please, is that it's about more than just distributing the time. Time is operating really differently, has been operating really differently for all of us when we're, having to shift the way that we live and work into our homes and juggling things like homeschooling and caregiving. So we have less time, but in the virtual environment, we actually were discovering that it was taking more time to do everything than we would find in person. So a very interesting contraction of time happening. Next slide, please. And we had to go kind of back to the beginning and think about, what is the design sprint afforded us? And in the past, it was really this container, this brand, a calling card that would get us in the door and allow us to get everybody together in a room. And then, we could work it out once we got in the room. We would do a lot of advanced planning, user research, problem framing, talking with our stakeholders, making sure that we were using everyone's time really effectively. But sometimes, next slide, please, we would find that actually this is what we were doing when we got into the room. We did, similar to some of Surya's wonderful illustrations, a lot of the process ends up, being pivoting in the moment while you've got all of the important and the right people in the room to do the work. So we actually had we had to look at what are our real goals and our very, very crisp goals for every session that we're holding. Next slide, please. And I've been thinking about this as this concept of atomizing the sprint. What are the goals of each of the activities in the sprint, and how is that getting us towards a larger goal? Can we break down that larger goal in a way that we can make progress more effectively with people's time? Next slide, please. So this means really crisply focusing on the goals for each sprint or session. And that's not always about product outcomes. A lot of times it is, but we would get benefits from getting everyone in a room together, like shared vocabulary, knowledge sharing, increased collaboration. And sometimes you wouldn't set that out as the goal for the session. But now we have to be even more intentional about designing these sessions for the needs of not just the product, but also the people. Next slide, please. We also had to get the tech and the tools right so the sessions would go smoothly. There's always going to be something that goes wrong, but we need to build the confidence in the technology, and a lot of that was getting comfortable with what are the different tools. I know a lot of folks have had many discussions about what are the tools to be used and what tools are available, but this was something that we had to onboard ourselves to very quickly. Next slide, too, please. And as I mentioned, designing for the the humans that we're bringing into these sprints, because really it is all about the people, co-creating together, building relationships and connections together so that they can be more creative and collaborate and problem solve together. And recognizing when sometimes we really need that sprint to improve the conversation, to improve the collaboration, not just for the outcomes. So this is something that maybe in the past we kind of got for free when we would get together in person, and now we'd have to spend more time planning and prepping for it. Next slide, please. So the outcomes from our quick pivot earlier this year was we developed these really quick reusable templates and tools for everyone across the company to use. And we allowed folks like the Cloud UX team to better identify opportunities to meet their customers' needs with sessions focused on empathy mapping. Next slide. And aligning a team on the product MVP. So not running the whole sprint all the way to the prototype and user test, but really narrowing in on what we need right now is to define those critical user journeys together collaboratively. And the Google Health team did this earlier this year. Next slide. Mapping assumptions to find gaps and understand what we don't know. The Google Classroom team used this this spring as well to help identify these gaps so they would know where to invest their resources. Next slide, please. And there were teams even setting long-term visions and roadmaps in longer sessions over multiple days and really looking at, who needs to be involved in these conversations? How do we spread these out to get the outcomes that we need? Next slide, please. And even some of these more softer benefits, such as helping a team form, helping a team create a shared vision or a shared understanding of their value proposition, and doing fun activities in tools like Mural. Next slide. Yes. So with all of this, we were able to keep our team sprinting. We were able to keep our velocity, and we had over 60% of our teams actually continued to run sprints and participate in sprints. And one of the questions in the chat is, how could we be focused on not in-person, on only in-person collaboration? And I will say we have many different forms of collaboration across the company. Design sprints are a specific type in which we really got the value out of bringing people together synchronously, but we use many different techniques for asynchronous collaboration. So I just want to make sure people get the picture that it's not like this was the only method that we had or do continue to have. We use lots of amazing Google tools for this, for asynchronous collaboration across the globe. But one of the things that we did end up finding some great benefits, to build on what Surya was saying about this being a real opportunity time, we found that this did allow us to have even more engagement from engineering and product, because this became a relief from their daily activities that they were doing, an opportunity to work in a different way. We were able to include people that maybe couldn't get on a plane and fly. So folks that have other restrictions in their lives and weren't able to actually participate in person. So this really made it more inclusive, as well as working digitally, could also becomes a leveling ground and creating space for more quieter voices. We found this to be a big benefit, that people are able to contribute more broadly across. And then, of course, the sprint documents itself, when you're working in a digital tool, and our sprint masters have been pretty happy about that. There's a lot of upfront work, even more upfront work, to design our sessions, but in the end, we save some of that when we have to share and document and spread the learnings from the sprint afterwards. Next slide. And from here, in addition to spreading and scaling this across Google, many Sprint Masters have also been contributing back to the community, running sprints for things like the California public school system. We ran a 5-team sprint to help the California schools figure out how to go back to school with distance learning this fall. We worked with the New York City Public Services group of nonprofits to increase access to employment opportunities and public services. And we've had teams working with focused on equity health research to improve access to health opportunities. So lots of great impact from the increase in our skills remotely and virtually to be able to reach out beyond the confines of our own locales, and to pivot and continue to learn and grow as an organization. And thank you to the Google Emoji team, which is my next slide, because I love the beautiful emojis that they create. Thanks, Steph, for driving.
Thank you so much, Kai. Of course, you can unmute yourself and clap. Amazing. Yeah. So I was trying to follow up on the slide deck, but it worked. So I couldn't follow the chat. Is there any question for Kai? Maybe you can open your mic and ask the question directly. So
one person asked about the soft benefits of in-person sprints in the chat. I'm not sure if soft is the right word, but it's the what happens when we do have time and we make time and space for conversations that don't happen because you're not always in the same office, or you don't have a chance to run into each other in the kitchen, or the water cooler, as they say. So we get that space and time for people to share their perspectives, and the collaboration methods really make room for those conversations as well.
Can I ask a question about, I'm sure it's secret, but what are the topics of these sprints? Are they about products? Are they about the way you work now because of COVID? Can you disclose a little bit about what kind of challenges you have?
Yeah, I mean, historically, we've used sprints for all kinds of things, right? We'll use them to, foundationally to improve our products and make our products more user-centered. But we also use them to improve processes. So in terms of, in this time, people have definitely turned to this methodology to help them figure out how do we better, support our employees at home? How do we better communicate? You can use that process to problem solve or to co-create together solutions, as well as defining product vision, improving your critical user journeys and things like that. Which tools was another question that just popped into the chat. Do we use during sprints? In virtual sprints, now we've been using a variety of tools, including Mural, as well as Google Slides and Google Drawing, and of course, Meets. And that's, for the collaboration. We need a collaboration canvas. For prototyping, we have all the standard prototyping tools that teams will use for digital products. So, it really is dependent on the problem space that you're working in. If you're designing a digital product versus a process versus a physical product.
Sabrina, do you want to ask a question?
Oh, sure. Thank you. Hi, Kai. Nice to thanks for your talk. I would have a question. Are the remote design sprints have another impact to your solutions and products? Do you already have an evidence about that?
So It's an interesting question because, you know, we always talk about the impact of design sprints and how long does it take to see the evidence. So we're, you know, 5 or 6 months into this right now, and our launch timelines are, you know, relatively longer than that. But what I will say is the evidence that we're seeing is around being able to maintain our velocity, maintain the speed at which we're working, which is one of the things that we rely on design sprints for alignment and shared vision. But we also rely on it as a method to make a way to make decisions faster, to get evidence and data to support, you know, or to make sure that we're investing in the right products. So we are still able, with remote testing and remote design sprints, to continue working in the way we would normally, you know, on the similar timelines. Hopefully that answers your question. The evidence is coming. The projects are being launched. Yes.
Yeah, it's exactly the same here. You know, even on shorter timelines, it takes time to really measure because you have what you get at the end of the week, but there is what you get after a month or years. There is a question from Sharon.
Well pronounced. Appreciate hi all, great to be here. I had an outside-in question. As an outsider, let's say we look at Google as, let's say, digital first, digital only in everything, and you gave us the impression a little bit that Google had to handle, let's say, the reality of going from all in-person sprinting and collaboration to a more virtual style. Was that a surprise? Was that a wake-up call? How is Google looking back at, let's say, the notion of having to change that way of working and being so in-person oriented, being such a digital and virtual company?
Well, I think it's less about being digital and virtual and more about being global, because as we can see here, we're all operating on different time zones. And when you fly somewhere, you normalize your time zone. We're all there together. We're all working right now. We can't ask people to work all night long. So we actually have to converge space, or I mean time, right? So we have to converge time. And that was really where we found the big challenge, less around, you know, having the right tools, because we were able to get up to speed and have the right tools and have the processes to do the work. And more comes down to the humans, where we have people who have lives in different places around the world, and to bring them together in a way that it is respectful of, you know, their work-life balance. All of these are the things that I think are much more challenging to resolve than the digital aspect or the technology aspect of it. It just comes down to the fact that in order for me to, you know, get to be on for the first speaker this morning, I had to wake up at like 6 a.m. where it's dark out, and you know, and so. Sorry. Yeah, no, I'm happy to. I guess I'm just saying that it is a moment where you realize, you know, we can overcome space, but we can't always overcome time.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Michael Villomier.
Yes, hi, thank you for today. My question is more about how you manage or try to influence the difference in motivation from or the implication of the participants during a sprint, especially now that they're going remote. I know some people are not really sometimes motivated at the beginning, and how do you try to manage that part?
Let me see if I got the question. How do you manage people's motivations in the sprint to get them to be engaged and influence their participation? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, because sometimes you have people that are very motivated and they have control remote or through a screen, and some others really prefer the in-person. So you notice different motivation between the two people. So how do you have tips to manage that?
Yes, actually, that was one of the areas that we really did spend some time leaning into, which is how do you create a sense of connection and safe space virtually, which is it's different than when you're doing it in person. So we've been training our sprint masters in virtual facilitation methods, mindfulness, improv, even to try to set the space in virtually that creates a sense of safety for people to participate. We also rely on each person's participation, because that's one of the best things about the sprint process is it's very clear when you don't contribute. So each person has their turn, each person has their individual creation. So we don't actually struggle so much with that participation once you set those ground rules, but we, there are folks who are less engaged, can be less engaged if they don't have a really strong connection to the context of the sprint. So the other thing that we'll do is make sure that everyone who's participating and attending is really critical to the outcomes, or really understands what their role is. And a lot of times that is helping to define their role for them and let them know what the expectations of them are when you invite them to the sprint. And I will often do that in advance when we invite people in. Does that answer your question? Great.
Amazing. We have a question from Kate.
Hello. Thank you, Kai, for a great talk. Appreciate it, your time and your expertise. So my question is around how do design sprints fit into the rest of your team's roadmaps? So when you're getting these cross-functional people together, like developers and data people, they all have their different roadmaps and plans. So getting everybody to align to a sprint, how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think over time, we have gotten a better approach to it, which is, I think, really something to be thought of at a cultural level across the company. There are specific times in the year where people will say, well, we need to do a sprint now because we're going to be doing our resourcing, or we're going to be doing our road mapping. So we'll actually find an increase in requests for sprints, usually towards fall planning, when people are thinking about the next year, and they'll bring everyone together to align on, what is our vision going to be for next year. So we'll set the sprints specifically in the calendar to influence those roadmaps. So rather than, say, randomly holding a sprint and then being like, oh, sorry, the roadmap's already set. And this is actually one of the things that we advise in our training, is to always have a conversation with the product team and understand the roadmaps already in place, and make sure that sprint is going to be pushing those goals forward and is being held at a time when the outcomes will be actionable. So we usually find, at least in the beginning of the year and towards the end of the year, are kind of the hot spots for when people decide to run bigger sprints. But there are teams that work in more regular sprints that are maybe more iterative rather than long-term vision setting or roadmap setting. So it also depends on the type of sprint that you're running and what the end goal of it is.
Thank you.
Berat, do you want to ask your question?
I think the previous question was sort of similar to mine, but I could just repeat it, see if I could address the topic from different angle. Is my sort of like my concern with design sprint is the goal setting. I've been in those design sprint workshops that clients, we didn't properly address the goal that we want to achieve, and it was absolutely a waste of time. So how do you avoid such situation? Like, I mean, I know it's a big topic. Maybe like if you have like some, hard-earned tips to share when it comes to defining goals for the design sprint, that would be really valuable for me. Thank you.
Yeah, one of my favorite relatively new tools is problem framing. So even running a shorter session in advance using some problem framing methods. Jay Malone has a nice one from New Haircut. And setting the time in advance of a longer sprint to bring together a couple of higher level stakeholders to really frame the problem. Because I have certainly, as you mentioned, been in a sprint where we didn't do enough of that in advance, and we didn't have the right people in the conversation when we started the sprint because we hadn't narrowed the focus down early enough. So if you aren't able to get a really clearly defined problem through stakeholder interviews and conversations with your team, actually hosting a short session can be really valuable before you launch into a bigger sprint.
Amazing. Jackie, do you have a question for Kai?
Sure. Kai, thanks for your time today. I'm just wondering, do the Sprint Masters sit as a centralized resource, or are they embedded in the product teams?
So it's an interesting model. They are embedded in the product teams, but they are encouraged and very frequently do run sprints for other product teams. So acting kind of like a centralized volunteer crew. And one of the principles of Google, which I really love, is embracing mobility. And so people do move from one product to the next. You spend a couple years working on photos and then feel like, you're really interested about maps or something like that. So our Sprint Masters are, experts that get a lot of value from working with other product teams. This helps to build your relationships. It helps to cross-pollinate ideas across the organization. And so it kind of becomes this added benefit to both the Sprint Master and the product teams that they work with, because they can be they can bring an outside perspective to the challenge. Often it can actually be quite hard to be a facilitator in your own product area. And I think I see one about facilitating and taking part. I'll just jump onto that. We highly recommend that facilitators do not also act as sprinters in the sprint. I personally have done it myself, and we have a number of Sprint Masters who are, say, the only UX designer on their team, and they're asked, to fill in for that resource. Unfortunately, it's really hard to be a good facilitator and a good participant at the same time. So we generally recommend you don't do that. And if you can recruit somebody to be that essential UX resource, or if it's your team, to recruit another facilitator. And that's where our volunteer group really comes in handy. If I need a sprint run, I can just email the group and say, can somebody come help? I need to participate in this one.
Great. I have one last question. Do running design sprint help you kind of recruit the right profile at Google? Like, is it making designers or people excited to be on sprints, or engineers? Is it a help for you?
Is it let me just make sure I understand. Is it, do people enjoy being on sprints? Is that contribute to their job satisfaction?
Yeah, if it helps you to find the right profile that people want to join Google because they can be part of sprints.
I think ultimately it is a better way of working, which is part of why I'm talking to all of you guys today, because it's really changed the way that I work. So having that as a way of working and having people understand it as a way of working helps when people come to Google, because they'll know that we have really great ways of collaborating, and we do encourage those relationships across those silos that I was mentioning. Like 11 years ago, we had really much more challenging silos than we do now. We have really strong UX support. We have strong relationships with our engine product teams. So my hope is that is something that other people also look for and benefit from. So the design sprint process enables that and makes it a great place to work.
Great. Thank you so much, Kai, for everything, for your time, for the presentation, for going over the technical challenges. We did it. Thank you so much. I'm asking everyone, please unmute yourself. Big round of applause for Kai. It was amazing to have you on board.
Yeah, thank you, Steph. It was
Kai,
wonderful.
will you stay during the networking session?
I will be there.
Amazing.
So continue the conversation.
So see you there in the room, and we're gonna take a short break of half an hour. So we meet at 30 past, and our next speaker is Mr. Jake Knapp, who is the creator of the Design Sprint at Google. See you soon.